beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Oh, there've been times that I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long,
How y'all doing?
a
I see
long
someone in
time
the very, very,
coming,
very
but
back
I know
exercising their right
change gonna come.
to lean back. Invitations for people to move forward.
So if you use the mic, then
Move forward. I like seats. I like chairs. I like very non-formalized spaces, I guess you could say, because we're often in these formalized spaces. So if you all can move forward, and we're going to make this a little conversation with the number we have here of people.
By the river, in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river I've been running.
So in order to start this off as a person who tells stories and who believes in spirits and energies and ancestors and love and life, and despite the statistics in the world that there are some beautiful things not only possible but inevitable for humanity in these coming days, I do come from a tradition that believes we're never as alone as we think, and not just metaphorically but metaphysically, meaning we walk with people. They're around us every day. It's why you can be on a stage of one, meaning you're up here, and there's about 10 to 15,000 people out there, and you don't have stage fright. Because you know behind you and with you are a whole bunch of ancestors, and they roll deep wherever we go. And you walk differently on this planet when you have that knowledge. Your spine becomes a little bit more straight. But because I do believe in life that way, it's important for me whenever I start a conversation, even a gathering, when it's supposed to be keynote, which means one directional. You all listen and go, oh, great, brown man speaks, yay, happy. That there's many people in the room. And so what I would like to start off with, if you could say your name, where you were born, and where your grandparents were born. And I want to use those two questions in order to kind of launch this conversation over the next hour about human rights and the human right to grow. So who's the eager side of the room? The left side or the right side? To the left, to the right, who's... Okay, left side feeling hyphy this morning. So we'll start off with you. If you could say your name, where you were born, and where your grandparents were born. And I will say one thing real quick. When I was recently in Delhi and we were holding this conversation, and I was like, oh, where were you born? Da, da, da. And they're like, where were your grandparents born? And I'm like, and they're like, India. And I was like, India, yeah, as if India's a homogenous place, of 1.25 billion people that can all be lumped into just this one word. So if we could be a little bit more specific than nation states, because nation states are recent concepts and frameworks for how we understand human identity or don't understand human identity, but maybe region or peoples more so than just like color-coded passport.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming.
All four of your grandparents.
A change gonna come.
Okay, yeah, y'all roll deep. That's important.
It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Oh, there've been times that I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been
South New York shit.
a long time coming, but I know change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
Got the whole
It's been too hard
which is a beautiful thing, because we have to remember, one, we do live on a planet, and that's hard to remember at times. And then that also, that we also are a species, which is also hard to remember at time. And I am a storyteller, and I'll tell a little bit about my family and my grandparents, who you see behind moment. I am a firm believer, as I said, that you carry people with you and you walk with you. And it's a person who comes from a storytelling tradition. And by storytelling tradition, I don't just mean this kind of modern version of whether you call it hip hop, whether you call it performance poetry, whether you call it lived theater, but this long-standing tradition of oral traditions and storytellings, which is at the very core how human beings understand time and possibility. Most of us, if you think about it, you're like, okay, what's the first memory I have? Is it when I was 10? When it was 5? When I was 3? And some people, you know, I do this in different places. They're like, oh, when I was 1, I have this picture of colors or of this, you know, movement or this thing happening in my life. And then you ask, well, what about before you were born? The memories of then, you know? And of course, it's like, I can't remember that. But we have pictures in our head of things before we were born. And we have pictures in our head of things that will come to be. You know, and these pictures are in our heads because of the stories we hear. And so stories, again, are how human beings relate to time. But those pictures also shape our idea of what is possible in this moment and has been possible across moments. So when most people speak about human rights, I find it done in 2 ways. The statistical way, which is, this is what's going on. We know these are the rates of sexual violence, these are the rates of displacement, these are the rates of torture, these are the rates of waterboarding, these are the rates of genocide and the numbers of people who are being buried by which group, and which group is ending up in the coffin. What I find, though, in this kind of engagement of human rights is it does something to human beings when we constantly tell ourselves only as statistics. It reduces us to quantitative entities. Human beings do not make sense of the world through statistics, but stories. And nations are nothing more than collections of narratives. And so for this next 45 minutes, I just want to tell some stories. And in this telling of stories, I want to not only reshape our idea of what is possible, but what has already been done. Because I think sometimes at this moment of trying to shift the trajectory of a planet or a species, we forget that we've already been in really beautiful places as people and as a species and as our cultures and as communities. So we're not so much trying to reinvent, we're trying to repair a lot of times. We're not simply introducing invention into existence. A lot of times it's just about how do we remember and return. And more specifically for indigenous communities, how do we reclaim? I'll open up spaces asking us to speak about where you were born and where your grandparents were born. Because how many people here are speaking a different language on the daily than their grandparents? Okay. And if you think about that, that also means you're dreaming in a different language than your grandparents. And if you think about dreams and through the process, the logic of the soul, or what Jung called the collective subconscious of the people, dreams are really what shape our fantasies, our imagination, as well as the means through which a lot of us receive prophecies and understandings over time. So how has our relationship to our ancestors, backwards, and the relationship to future children, those who we will be ancestors to, been changed because we are dreaming in a different language than them, and we're telling stories in a different way. My family, as you see above you, comes from a small village in central Mexico called Querétaro. And Querétaro is to the west of DF, called Mexico City. And they've been there for a long since the beginning of time, peoples. And up until about the 1900s, when the Mexican government started clearing out indigenous people from the central part of Mexico, and then the US government was clearing out people from what had become their recently, quote, acquired land of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, California, Nevada, and Utah, which was primarily Yaqui and Shoshone land. My grandmother used to tell stories about watching people being taken away in chains. And so she left. And she left to the capital to try to find a little bit of a refuge there. And then war broke out, more specifically an uprising of the Zapatistas in Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, whose birth had recently passed, a celebration of it. And even in uprisings, which can be so glamorized and romanticized at times, our own people still die, even when you're trying to stand up for what is right. And so my grandmother left again. And she ended up in this small village called Querétaro, where she met my grandfather. And they then left Mexico completely. And they ended up working the mines in Arizona, in New Mexico, in Colorado, where my father was born. And my father was born in a small village in southern Wyoming, and he grew up working the fields up from the age of 4, 5, and 6, already starting to go out and pick potatoes. And then something happened in 1941 that caused him to move. It was called World War II, and the U.S. entry of World War II. And what caused him to move is what caused our family to move, and which isn't spoken about much, which is that Oregon, Washington, and the state of California, up until about the last 20 years, primarily economy has been agricultural, meaning the way that the people have provided for themselves from a local to a state level has been the growing of crops. Farms, though, over the 19th and 20th century were primarily owned a lot of Japanese and Pinoy. When World War II broke out and they began throwing the Japanese into the concentration camps and sending them away, they also began seizing the farms. And they were faced with this conundrum, as short-sighted nations often are. We've just incarcerated a bunch of people which formed the entire basis of our economy. What the hell do we do now? We need new people to work and new people to grow these crops because we just locked up everybody else. And so that's what actually brought the first wave of what are called the Chicanos of northern Mexico into the Pacific Northwest, and the Plains natives into the Pacific Northwest. My oldest uncle really did not like the way they treated our family in the fields. Several of our aunts died from cancer, from the pesticides. They used to spray on them when they were working. And so he used to get in physical fights with them about, we do not like this treatment you are giving us. And so the farmers stopped hiring our family if he was around. So he got sent away to live on his own at the age of 13 and 14, and made his way down to Los Angeles at 13 and 14, and then made his way up to Alaska and working the coal mines up there and building the pipeline up there before it was even a state. And that's where I was born, in the mid-70s. And so when I think about this conversation of human rights and this dialogue or discourse, you could say, about through the way in which rights are articulated, I often find it very boring because it's always articulated through this language of statistics. Statistics strip our people of their emotional dignity when we're only reduced to numbers. When I first and foremost think of this concept of human rights, I think of my family. And I think about the things that people and human beings should have in place, not only to not harm you, but in order to encourage you to grow your heart, your soul, and your people. And then how has that been denied? As a storyteller, when I think about, again, the story of human rights, and I extend beyond my family, so you open up with a conversation about what does this mean to me? Is I then began to ask then, okay, what does this story mean to other people? And I have to remember that human, because if we're going to talk about this concept of human rights, is two words. There's human in it, and there's rights. And we have to begin with the definition. Because if you begin discussing terms without defining them, you're going to find you may end up on completely different trajectories, arguing about different things using the same language that you don't understand why you're confused on, because you haven't made clear what is the framework through which you are discussing people, beings. As a human being on this planet, I would think that human as a term would apply to me. However, we have to remember that the concept of human rights as we know it actually comes out of a very Western Enlightenment time. And that it's not just this idea of, like, you think about it, we're all human beings. That human actually can be broken down into three ways. Human is a species, the way we think about it, in terms of, like, okay, everybody's human beings, we all have these shared characteristics. But human beings are also definitions, and that definition then is put within a legal framework, in which then people are used to justify as beings or non-beings. Historically, I am not a human being. Historically, most of you here are not considered human beings. And we can look upon this within this continent in two very specific ways, an indigenous way and a stolen African way. If you look at the first framework of the Constitution, Africans are what? 3/5 of a human being, only for electoral purposes in terms of vote. We are a non-entity. So what does human rights mean if you're not included in the definition of human? And you can even go back, that framework actually came out of the Spanish in the late 1490s, 1492 to be specifically, as Queen Isabella has united the Spanish crown to finally, in her minds, drive the Muslims out of Spain and the Iberian alliance that they had formed with the Muslims. And so they push the Muslims out and they drive them into North Africa. There's a person there when that happens in this town called Al-Andalus. His name is Christopher Columbus. And he watches them being driven out, and 7 days later, he's given a decree which gives him boats. And then 3 months later, the Jews are beginning to be expelled from Spain as well. And as Columbus comes back 1 year later, after being in the Americas, and he tells about these people that he's met over there, and this new land and these new resources, a conversation comes up. Are they human beings? Do they have a soul? Are they Christian? If they're not, then we can massacre them because they're not human. So whenever we talk about this concept of human rights, it's a kind of love-hate relationship for me. Because I love this concept of human rights, but I wonder, what does this word mean, or this phrase mean, if historically it's excluded me from the conversation because legally I have not been included in the definition of human? And I think about that very clearly when I hear Buffy St. Marie. First Nations sister.
Now that you're wondering, how must they feel? Meaning them that you've chased across America's movie screens. Now that you're wondering, how can it be real that the ones you've called colorful, noble, and proud in your school propaganda, they starve in their splendor? You asked for my comment, I simply will render. My country, 'tis of thy people you're dying. Now that the long houses breed superstition, you force us to send our toddlers away to your schools where they're taught to despise their traditions, forbid them their languages, then further say that American history really began when Columbus set sail out of Europe, and stress that the nation of leeches that conquered this land are the biggest and bravest and boldest and best. And yet where in your history books is the tale of the genocide basic to this country's birth, of the preachers who lied, how the Bill of Rights failed, how a nation of patriots returned to their earth, and where will it tell of the Liberty Bell as it rang with a thud over Kinslow mud, and the brave Uncle Sam in Alaska this year. My country, 'tis all thy people, you're dying.
So when I think about what is human, and I think about my cousins who's Warm Springs, I think about my friends who are Yaqui, I think about the people I've known in different countries who have all suffered from invasion. We use these words like lonely, as if that word can somehow hold the emotional reality of what really happens to human beings in the process. That I began to wonder about this concept of human rights and what it means. Because in a reality is, and in an age of hyper-marketing language, it has to be stated that empire has made human a rank. And if your body, or the way you love, or the way you pray does not fit that rank, then you will either be upgraded or discontinued. And this is how history has played itself out over the last several centuries. And this is where it's hard to have a conversation on human rights coming from the body I operate within and the way I pray, because it's as if I'm already at a disadvantage. Because in the school books we face daily, in the cartoons placed on our children's breakfast table, in the songs we often hear marketed to us in our headphones, in the skin bleaching advertisements to make our bodies more beautiful, in the video games that reward the assassination of the darker skinned brown bodies, that the indigenous people of the Americas, the darker people of Africa, the aboriginal of Australia, and the global indigenous have rarely, if ever, been seen as human. And then we have to remember that this is not something that's only hundreds of years ago. Amnesty USA, in a 2000 report by the Truth Commission into Genocide in Canada, documented the responsibility of the Roman Catholic Church, the United Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Canada, and the federal government in the deaths of more than 50,000 Native children in the Canada residential school system. The report said school church officials killed children by beating, poisoning, electric shock, starved, prolonged exposure to sub-zero cold while naked, and medical experimentation, including the removals of organs and radiation exposure. In 1928, Alberta passed legislation that allowed school officials to forcibly sterilize Native girls. Currently, if you think about even though who ends up in the foster system, Native children are taken from their homes at a rate of 1,600% more likely than Caucasian students, where physical violence is the reason for only 1% of those cases. And so you think about this even in a modern concept. But that's only one part of the conversation, because we're trying to say, like, okay, what is human? And what does it mean to be human? And how do we get back to this conversation of a species? Because we are all human beings, even if the legal frameworks we operate within will not acknowledge that, or the social cultural frameworks we in try to deny that knowledge to us every day. Is that there's another word after human, and that's a right. So what is a right besides the opposite of a right? We use this word, it's like, it's rights, it's my right. The right is a normative rule or offering offered to human beings, meaning it is a normal engagement through which human beings understand and operate, that if it is violated, there should be some form of accountability. The interesting thing about rights for me is that the way most people refer to rights is not human. There's another word they put in front of it. Anyone have any guesses what that is? Civil. Does anyone know the difference between a civil right and a human right? A civil right, well, yes and no. Actually, civil rights are supposed to be are awarded to civilians, or in certain cases, as in supposedly the U.S., even if you're a non-citizen, if you're on the land, you are to be awarded that same right. However, what the civil rights often mean is under a state apparatus. So the right to vote is something that the state gives you. The right to speech is something that the state gives you, and something that if it is violated, you turn to the state in order to say, this has been done wrong to me, how do I repair it? The difference between a civil right and a human right is that a civil right says, as you were referring to commonly, it is something you get because you're a civilian, you're a citizen. A human right is something you get because you breathe air, because you have a heartbeat. And the primary difference between the two is that when you have a civil right violated, most people turn to the state. When in reality, when you look at human rights, you're normally being violated by the state. So why would you turn to the entity which is committing crimes against your body, against your people, against the people you love and your humanity in order to fix it? The question of why are human rights important then enters into play. Because if we're going to define a term, try to define human, and then we try to define rights, we have to then say, why is it important that we have this conversation at all? Because if it is not made meaningful to people, then why the hell have it? It's entertainment. Nothing wrong with entertainment, I enjoy it. But human rights, you know, if you have a choice as an essential conversation or an entertaining conversation, it should probably be an essential one versus an entertaining one, because an entertaining one, you can leave, peace out, deuces, this is a little boring, I don't want to deal with it. An essential one is something like, okay, yeah, I may not want to deal with water, but I kind of like water in my life. I like taking showers. I like drinking water. It's kind of necessary to breathe and live as a human being. So it's an essential conversation. So when we think about what happens when human rights get violated, and we think about it beyond just an individual perspective, because this is another issue with rights, is that it's often conceptualized as something that's awarded to a singular person, not a collective entity or a collective group of being, and how they're also dismissed or stolen from people are also collective. We have to remember that when you live in a world that actively violates the sanctity of human life, then you begin to normalize conditions that no one.
안녕하세요. 싸입니다. 저는 지금
Little ads. So again, when we're thinking about how human rights get violated, and to get past this idea of something that's only happened 400 years ago or 300 years ago.
For me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear baby more than I never knew. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Ooh, yeah.
Oh my word! Oh my word!
So, we have to think about human rights and the concept of when you start to piece time together outside of just this moment we're living in. And we start to remember our stories and the stories that have been silenced or stolen from us about all the ways beautiful people have been placed in an early grave. Because that really is what is at the core of human rights. Life expectancy. It's not just about a material condition in terms of economics or what Marx would call people's material reality. It's about how that material reality determines whether or not you will end up in an early grave or live a full and long life. And then what is the quality of that life while you're on this planet? Yet it's important that as we talk about human rights, that we do not just make it a state conversation. Because when we're looking at here, we're looking at acts of state violence. The ways in which state apparatuses and militaries have invaded sovereign nations and sovereign peoples and committed horrible acts of genocide and crimes against humanity that will never be called terrorism, because terrorism by definition is those who refuse to acknowledge the state has a monopoly on violence. So as long as we have a conversation about terrorism versus premature death and violence, we forever play catch up, because that's not an interesting story enough. Again, to rewind, to go back to this conversation of state violence versus social violence, is that we have to understand that people learn behavior through stories and through the culture that surrounds them. So what happens when this is the daily reality we see every day? Not on the television of this is who invaded who and this is how many are dead, but we watch our people die around us. What behaviors do we begin to normalize? And how do we even begin to perpetuate acts upon one another that violate the sanctity of human life, which again is the core element of human rights? Not just a legal framework, not just an abstract theory, but the idea of what is the engine through which human beings can create ideas that respect and grow life. In the absence of that, we begin to inflict harm upon one another's, and then if you think about it, we mirror or echo the acts of the state upon people, upon one another. And how is that more clear if we look at Boston and this bombing, this incident that happens, which is an act of violence that results in 3 people dead and 170 people wounded. And between when that act happens and a person is arrested, does anyone know how many days or hours go by? It's been in the news everywhere, but we don't, let's check our cognitive abilities of what's being presented to us. Anyone know how long it was between when the bombing happened and then when someone was arrested for the horrible act? About 48 to 72, 4 to 5 hours, or 4 to 5 days. So when I talk about social realities and how human beings living in a trajectory where human rights are violated on a structural level, not only in a singular moment, but over centuries, it would be fair to say that human beings would then begin to clone the behavior of the state upon one another. Yet, our discourse doesn't mirror that. We only talk about these certain acts of violence. And we forget within that same time span of when a person does a bombing and is arrested for it, several other things are happening within the US alone that we're not hearing about. You have 1,404 undocumented parents who had children who were US citizens who were deported, which you multiply that over the span of a year, you have 205,000 deportations of parents, separations of families. If we think about the human right to not be kidnapped, why is this not included in that? And within those same 4 to 5 days, we can also say you have 4,200 people in the US alone attempting suicide. Statistically, 1 million people in the US documented per year attempt to take their own life. Broken down over within 4 to 5 days, that equivalents every work week, 4,200 people have tried to end it. And where is this in the conversation of human rights and the sanctity of human life and how we have normalized our death where the coffin is more attractive than the streets? We can even look at this. Globally, 104,000 children, meaning human beings under the age of 10, died from preventable disease within that same 4 to 5 days. And there's no mention of that. And within the US alone, 172,000 people were sexually violated or stalked. So we have to talk about human rights and the violation of human rights, not as just something that is awarded to individuals, but actually as how do we shift the cultural gene pool of a society, both on a personal level as well as a structural level, in ways that do not only respond to the violation of life, but actually put into place the things that grow it. And how do you grow life specifically in this type of time we're living in, where trauma is normal and trauma is individualized? Meaning we hear so much about the death, it no longer affects our hearts. Or we hear about the death, a person takes their life, and we don't say there's 1 million people within this country who do that every year. That over 10 years, that's 10 million. Over 20 years, one generation, that's 20 million. It means within one generation, 8% of a society has tried to end their own life. That is not an individual trauma. That is a structural illness and a social epidemic that we don't blink an eye to. And somehow we think in this conversation of how do you grow a discourse around human rights and how do you grow engagement around human rights, that the way you get people engaged in it is by presenting more numbers and more pictures of dead children to them. When in reality, all that does is desensitize us more and dehumanize those who have been stolen more easily. We're perpetuating the narrative that we're supposed to end up in an early grave, even in the ways we're trying to fight it. And a large part of that is because of this last thing, is we've stopped having vision-centered frameworks. We only know how to respond to the violation of human rights, versus human rights is not just about the ways in which people have been harmed. It's how do you put in place structurally the ways in which human beings grow. And what do human beings need to grow in their specific indigenous, cultural, and regional context? And to think about that, what helps us heal and what helps us grow, and that is our human right. The human right is often articulated in things we do not want. We do not want to be stolen. We do not want to be deported. We do not want to be invaded, which is very necessary to articulate what are called our non-negotiables. These are things that cannot be violated. But how can we also talk about the right, which is in the Human Rights Declaration, the human right to clean water, the human right to return, and the human right to remain in terms of displacement and this social epidemic that's going on. And how can we understand human rights beyond an individual experience, but actually as an intergenerational reality? Meaning, how human beings understand what is socially, culturally, or structurally acceptable is not just an individual experience, it's an inheritance. It's something that you're learning from the way your parents were conditioned, raised up, or wounded, and the ways they passed it down onto you. Because your parents were children at one time. And they had experiences that changed the way they raised you. And you had grandparents who were children who at one time had experiences that changed the way they raised your parents, that changed you. And so most of us are in this second stage where we believe we've been born in this society that's wounded, and most likely we'll try to make a few key interventions at some time in our life, but we'll probably die in a society that's wounded. And we have accepted that. If you really think about, like, okay, in my heart of hearts at the core, do I really believe that the trajectory of society and the human species is going to shift within my generation? And if you ask people that on surveys, most of them would say no. Whether or not they believe over multiple generations then becomes complicated upon where they place themselves in, how profound they're daring to imagine. But a large part of this is because we forget that there's a stage one. That almost everyone here is an indigenous person from somewhere. That at one time, whether willingly or displaced, was forced out of a land. And when you go back to that concept, before displacement, and back into our creation stories, that we begin to remember in our creation stories that there was a time before trauma. And it's important to remember that because when you look at human rights studies and you look at ethnic studies and what are called the identity studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, religious studies, that often the stories they begin with are the invasion stories. Meaning our very first introduction to ourselves and who we are, even when we're in control of our own stories, is one of violence. And so what we have done to ourselves and to our beliefs and to our imagination is we have essentialized violence within our trajectory as a species. And when you do that, you forget there's a time before trauma. And if you don't remember there's a time before trauma, then you're not going to believe there's a time after trauma because trauma is now infinite. If trauma has a beginning, then we know scientifically anything that which begins must have an ending. Therefore, if trauma has a beginning, we know that one day it will end. States have beginning. Structures have beginnings. These are not infinite entities. Every society is on a trajectory. They are not fixed definitions. They are fluid. They have forms and they have frequencies. The forms can be shaped. The frequency can be altered. And that's just a historical fact. Whether or not that frequency is altered to kill more people or make sure people live longer, that's what's negotiable. So how do we begin to chart towards a time where we're born in healing and we're living in healing? How do we center our imagination as a human rights framework? Meaning we are no longer just speaking against things we're against, but we're really centering what we're for. And to really understand that imagination is the engine of innovation. It is the ways in which normalization becomes interrupted. That if you cannot imagine another reality, how can you begin to construct it? And to also understand outside of an individual framework of human rights, which is often a kind of echo of the civil rights framework of these are my individual rights. That there's multiple countries that not only have what are called human rights, they also have human responsibilities to each other. That it's not just about what's awarded to us. It's about what we're obligated to do to each other on the basis of having a heartbeat. And the last, which is getting into Bolivia nowadays, which they just passed last year, which is the rights of Mother Earth, of Pachamama. Specifically in indigenous epistemologies in the Americas, when you look at relationships to land, Vine Deloria, a brilliant Dakota scholar, talked about that the invasion of the Americas at the core was not a fight solely over land, it was about a relationship to time. That Western civilization viewed time as something that was a binary. There was a past behind you. And you're living in a present, which is only this moment. And there's a future that's coming. And that future is your destiny, which you turn to certain scriptures for and says, this is what is awarded to you. And he said, that's not the way we all live. Not all of us view time as that line. Some of us view time as the secondary way in which we know ourselves. Age isn't a concept. We come from the land and we return to the land. So what does time mean in that construct? I have a relationship to this place because it is a part of me. It's not something you own, it's something I have a responsibility to. And so when you look actually, and I had written down these notes here, the Bolivia context of human rights of Mother Earth is really interesting because they say there is a human right to life, and they call it the maintenance of the integrity of life systems, meaning that animals themselves have a life system, human beings have a life system, and the earth has a life system, and they're all interconnected. And one cannot violate or infringe upon the other without throwing that entire ecosystem out of balance. And so how do we get back to that type of articulation of human rights to grow, about an ecosystem, both physical and emotional, that is centered around this idea of development, not just response to violation? The dynamic living system formed by the indivisible community of all life systems and living beings whom are interrelated, interdependent, and complementary, which share a common destiny, adding that Mother Earth is considered sacred in the worldview of indigenous peoples and nations. How do we center these things? And how do the stories and the ways that we try to grow human rights shift when we make this our framework? And if you even think about it, there's different prototypes I've worked with people in terms of what are called your public marketing campaigns. How do you shift a discourse in society? How do you create images and phrases which become the engine for new conversations and ways that are engaging aesthetically for people? How do we stop responding to the existing discourses and conversations that have already been placed in front of us by people who did not have your best interest in heart? I do not need to spend time explaining to a bigot about the way I pray. I have no need to justify myself. I'd rather grow people and grow healthy people than spend time trying to get the social acceptance of people who would rather probably physically abuse me. Every person on this planet has 24 hours in a day. That day is measured very differently, depending upon culture. But where are you investing your day? In what conversations and with what people? And are you thinking about the conversations you want to grow versus just the conversations you're being forced to respond to? I want to close off just with a song to kind of just put us in a little bit of different energy. And we'll save the last couple minutes for any questions. Just of what happens when you center imagination, you center human right to life and to grow in ways that are passionate, knowing that passion is contagious, that there does exist this thing called passion capital, that emotional transaction which makes people become involved. That how do we begin to tell those stories? And how do those stories make us feel different about ourselves and the work we are doing? To end what's called the activist or social change burnout, which results in a variety of health issues in of itself.
This is a letter to my countrymen, especially those my age and younger than. We're up against an ugly trend. Everybody hustling, don't nobody touch their friends. No group singing and dancing, no anthem, nobody holds hands in. Instead, they give you a handheld and make you shoulder life's burden by your damn self. One thing that can't be debated, power never changed on its own, you gotta make it. That's why community is so sacred. That's the symbol that we make when we raise fists. Advantage is given to the few that are built into the roots of our biggest institutions. That's the truth in life, we gotta choose. Do I fight in the movement or think I'm entitled to it? This is not a practice life, this is the big game, we gotta attack it right. Each one of us is headed for the grave. This old crooked world won't be saved by the passive type. This is a letter to my countrymen, not from a Democrat or a Republican, but one among you. That's why you call me brother. Ain't scared to tell you we're in trouble, cause I love you. Tell me I'm a dreamer, they ridicule. They feel defeated, old, bitter, and cynical. Excuse me, but I see it from a different view. I still believe in what a driven view could really do. I know that the masses wanna sleep, and they would just rather hear me rapping to the beat. But I wanna pass this planet to my son a little better than it was when they handed it to me. So I wrote a letter to my countrymen. I'll be happy if it only reaches one of them. Reporting live, ALI, your brother.
Just returning to that concept. That if you think about sunflowers, sunflowers don't ask for permission to grow. We ask for permission far too often. You don't need permission to grow. You grow. And you dismantle the things that prevent you from growing. And you nurture the things that help you grow. And you start with a micro base, and you advance an idea, and you expand the circle, and you center always, where do we grow to? We always grow towards the sun. End of the day, everyone grows towards the sun. I want to pause for the last 5 minutes. Any questions, comments, concerns, aspirations, hope, dreams, visions, all of the above? I always point out how traumatized the education system has left us. It's funny when you think about the human right to education. What does that mean? Because often people confuse the human right to education with the human right to schools. In schools is a social structure through which a society determines what knowledge is valuable and what is not, and how children get forced into schools. When you look at boarding schools, which became cultural death camps for entire peoples, that I put people in small circles, conversations. Sometimes they're bigger circles. You can have like 200 and small micro groups, and you have intergenerational groups, and you got little kids, some are like 8 and 10, and you got people who are like 50 and 60, and they're all having this conversation, and they're like, everybody's talking, and they're like, oh, da-da-da-da. And then you come back, okay, are there any comments or thoughts? And everybody, it's funny, even if they're 50 or 60 years old, it's like this little trigger goes on in their brain, and all of a sudden they're 10 again, and they're like, look down. Don't make eye contact. I swear to God, I'll do my homework next time. It's a friendly environment. So, any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, aspirations, hope, dreams, visions, all of the above, clarifications, dreams, aspirations, more coffee. Yes. More questions? An abundance of beauty with some painful moments inside, which is how it's kind of always been. But I often think about it too. When you think about, like, sometimes I think our hearts get heavy when you read your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, and like, oh my God. And then I remember, well, what if there was Facebook during the Middle Passage or during different genocides? And I was like, the worst is behind us. I mean, you have the most technologically advanced nations of militarized attacking farmers, and we're still here. And now we actually have more resources and are growing those resources. So the potential of shifting that trajectory, and even those who, when you think about it in terms of like, Europe's not a homogenous place, and I think even those who have adopted the structural identity we currently live in are realizing how damaging it is, and are realizing things need to shift for everyone. So the conversation is expanding. What I see as being really essential is moving outside of a discourse of response and back to a vision-based discourse. Meaning, how do we speak about growing and center that constantly in our life? And how does that affect our own physiological health? Because a lot of my work has to do with the relationship between stories, public discourse, and the way that actually turns into health issues for communities. So those are some of the things that I see on the horizon. It's just like that articulation of the human right to grow, the kind of response I was writing based on the statistics after the Boston bombing was life. It's bigger than terrorism. And the reality, even ironically, if you think about it within U.S. society, that the greatest threat to American life is actually other Americans. Go to other countries, it's very different. Sometimes the greatest threat to your life is Americans, or whatever occupying force you're living under. But that within this society, that's actually what is going on. So how do we have a conversation about what we call mirrors up? That it's time to put our mirrors up. Get in conversations and everyone put your mirror up. Meaning the first person we're looking at is ourselves, and then we're having conversations about what we're seeing and what's the same and what's different, because we're not clones. I don't believe in this clone type of equality. I believe that human beings are different shades and different peoples for different reasons. A planet of clones is really boring to me. Those are what I see on the horizon theoretically. Framework-wise, Bolivia did pass the rights of Mother Earth in the Constitution. You're having a kind of resurrection of how do you hold states accountable to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and is the legal framework of global law and global human rights the direction people should be pushing in right now. You do have a battle around the privatization of water in Central American countries, and even the WTO recently saying, like, to think that everyone has a human right to water is an extremist belief. So you do see some people amping up these very bigoted ideas. You see other people really engaging and expanding the idea. I think what's really beautiful right now is dreaming globally. It has to be dreaming globally. The more I travel globally, the more I find that the conversations are echoes of one another. And that as those echoes, there's also strategies that can be pulled from one another and solutions from one another. because it's a global system and we're a global planet. So why do we only deal with our issues on a local level? And I'll get to you.
First off, I wanted to say that this kind of process is really a big win because I realized how academic and socialized trying to be sitting there academically about what you're saying, you know, and it's kind of helping me kind of snap back at it, you know, seeing it, think about some of my conversations as emotion and passion instead of just numbers.
Yeah.
That was really good. And I also wanted to ask about what it was interesting how you asked us not to think about where because I do international studies teacher and I've always thought that was nation states, you know, the imagined community, maybe some new Western, you know, European idea of nation states. So in terms of human rights and justice, what would you, how would you picture that? How do you picture, how would you identify communities all over the world instead of
I think the right to self-identification and collective identification is essential. So I have my own frameworks, and then when I enter different communities, I sit and I listen to what their framework is. I think the concept, you know, which was shared with me recently, respect, it takes time, is very important, because I think part of that relationship to time and this expediency is that we enter places and we expect to automatically understand the framework of people who have lived in a region for millennium and who have passed that knowledge down, and children are raised within it. And even children who are raised within it don't get every story at like young ages. You have to wait for certain markers. And not everyone tells every story. Only certain people are allowed to tell other stories. And so in that, I think sometimes we think that, oh, I can enter and no, it's like we got to pay our dues. But not to the structures, to the people. To me, I just continually look at this Umma Gente tribe. When you look at the Islamic concept of a global family based upon a shared belief and the responsibility to each other. Gente, which is translated as people, but it's also like my heart. And tribe, you know, the collective kinship system and the ways in which people are brought in and for what reasons and are also held accountable. Those kind of three levels really resonate to me these days, because they're really what we think of a nation state as, but it's never been. Because the nation state is about a forced identity and the exclusion of others. And when you look at Gente, Umma, and tribe, there are ways in which people are allowed in or are not allowed in, but there's an obligation and an emotional connection to one another that I think gets left out of these other collective identity-based frameworks. And those are the things I encourage people to just look up of. Like, the reality is, who's your tribe? Who's your family? You know, there's blood family and there's love family. Like, you know, who's your gente? Who's your people? People is a word. Race, gender, sexuality, religion, these are all constructs that are based on actual things that human beings are or do, but the framework itself is a construct. So people is a definition that's always changed. So what is our definition? What are the new parameters? Do we grow it or limit it? I mean, that's an option too. Yes, sir. And then we'll close because I know we're running. Alhamdulillah. really, really excellent questions. I think the conversation of how do human beings react to stories or not, or deny hearing it. What that is more along the lines of around this conversation or relationship between the sphere of human development and social conditioning. How do human beings grow? What formulates their identity, their value system, what they believe is important, and what do they deny? And then the spheres through which they push those values or advance them, whether as an individual or as a collective entity. And then the social spheres and social conditioning, then how does larger structural values get taught to people in order to perpetuate the trajectory of a society, whether or not that trajectory is harmful or helpful to humanity. The ways in which I kind of operate is this premise that human beings want to be listened to and need to be heard. And that, again, we don't make sense of the world through statistics, but stories. And that in order to avoid the cognitive dissonance that comes from being confronted with a reality that challenges what we've been taught or conditioned, you avoid the stories. So for me, then it becomes, how do I tell a story that's more engaging, that pulls you in? Social Discourse 101 says, the person who asks the first question frames the entire dialogue. We're often responding to the dialogue. Person says, the Boston bombing. And my thing is like, word. I believe life is important too. Don't you? I always find questions are more engaging than responses, because responses often are furthering the discourse. A question offers the potential to reshape and reshift it, but it has to be placed imaginatively. So to me, it's like, word, yes, how horrible that this life was taken. Yes, how horrible that life is taken. But how big is your heart? Because I believe like the human heart is infinite. So how horrible that this life is taken versus this life and this life and this life. Wait a minute, why is this life more important than the other? Like you've segregated life? And I think it's really just placing those things in front of people. Sometimes they get upset. My mother committed suicide when I was 14. I placed the story that I wrote about her on the 20th anniversary of her suicide in the center of almost every conversation. And the letter that I wrote is a remix of what they call the suicide letter's perfect moment of selfishness. That what that really offers people, that moment before they take their life, is actually a moment of vulnerability that they often don't have at any moment in their life. So how do we claim that moment at other times? And placing that in people, that's one of the things that I find always hits people in ways that other stories don't. Because the walls are up of this is politics, this is real. And when that conversation is open, it's when I talk about how did we learn to devalue life, whether our own or others. Because that's what it comes down to. When I'm working with friends who are doing work around street violence or state violence, and then they're having experiences around suicide within their own micro community or their own personal life, and they're like, I'm not equipped to deal with this. I'm like, yes, you are, because it's the core question is the same. When did we learn to devalue life? Those are not separate. They're substrands of that question. Street violence, state violence, and suicide are all substrands of the questions of how do we learn to devalue life? And it's that way you find which one people connect with emotionally, and then you expand it to the others and say, this isn't an either or. We don't have that luxury as a species. It has to be done simultaneously. Now, which one you may be more passionate about will determine which time investment you offer. But you understand that it's all interrelated and interconnected. And second question, education. I'd say check out Sir Kenneth Robinson's Shifting Education Paradigm. It's a TED Talk that was really, really innovative. I have a couple frustrations with it. But it's really about the collapse of the Industrial Revolution model of education and what the future of knowledge production looks like. Because education isn't about schooling, it's about knowledge production. Schooling is the secondary or even third conversation after how do human beings formulate knowledge and what is knowledge and why is it important to different people in different contexts. My frustration with the video is it completely focuses on the Enlightenment growth of structural education, and it leaves out everything from madrasas to indigenous ways of passing on stories to other religious forms of knowledge production. It's a very this is what was going on in Europe, and this is how it grew in the US, and ignores the rest of the continents. But it provides a really, I think, powerful opening up that's animated, and I love cartoons. Because the other thing is, if people don't connect with the story you're telling, visually, aesthetically, linguistically, then it's like, that was nice. It's like cartoons, though, telling you. If y'all are any graphic illustrators in here, cartoons are where it's at. You put cartoons in front of people, it's on. And we'll close with the last question. Those are questions. So I will say two things. I actually did a conversation on this with, there was the Islamic Human Rights Commission of the UK. And they're like, why do you tell storytelling? Why do you tell stories? And I was like, two answers. One, we're a storytelling generation. The entire social media framework is based upon stories. And then second, we're a storytelling species, which is, again, it's the primary process through which human identity is formulated. It's how human beings interact with time. It's how we formulate our understanding of collective sense or sense of self. We've always told stories. With the introduction of a new technology comes new questions and the reshaping of a storytelling process. It should not completely replace old forms. It also should not be completely relied upon. It also should not be completely dismissed because it's a new form. The drum at some point in human society was new technology. Print making was a form of new technology. Social media is a form of new technology. So how does this reshape our understanding of stories? What is different about this time is that it's not just an introduction of a new medium, it's a paradigm shift in how human beings understand and relate to stories. Meaning it's changing all the mediums. And we're at the first stage of its introduction. So we don't know what it's going to look like. We actually have the beautifully difficult responsibility of participating in what it will look like, and negotiating and trying to push for what we think is important. I find that what I would like for social media to kind of engage, and I've had these conversations with different people, is one, you see a birth of what they're called storytelling apps. And storytelling in terms of social media and storytelling technology are really about to take off in terms of iPhone, iPad apps, how they're being incorporated into schools, how they're being utilized in data processes in terms of what's called quantitative data, how you capture data in ways that are not just about numbers, but are actually experiential based. That what you're starting to see in this kind of explosion, though, is still a reliance upon the one-directional form of storytelling. I tell story, people listen. Someone creates a story, people press play, they listen. There's not an interactive experience. And that's where I'd really like to see it go. Because that actually offers what print media could not. And what print media actually had killed for a lot of storytelling. Which, if you think about, how many people know the game of Telephone? Y'all know this game, like you've heard it? Telephone is often used to show like how stories change. To me, actually, what Telephone has been used is a means to try to dismiss oral traditions by increasing the process through which stories, the pace through which stories were told. What Telephones proved to me is the importance of accountability in a storytelling process. You weren't allowed to just tell the story and then tell it to someone else. It was like, story, tell it back to me. No, you got it wrong, tell it again. No, you got it wrong, tell it again. So there was an interaction going on. And then when you shared it with the community, there was an interaction going on. When print media came, it allowed human imagination to really play with ideas and documentation and characters and spacing, but in a lot of ways, it stole that interaction. And so the question then comes up at this point is, where does the interaction go from here, now that that possibility is present again? And that is, it's up for grabs. It's up for questions. So the simplest way to kind of break it down is, has anybody ever told you something that hurts your feelings? Okay. Have you ever seen a movie and cried, even though you know it's a fictional movie? Okay, y'all seen a movie and cried? People? You're like, yeah. You're like, oh yeah, yesterday it was horrible. Why'd she leave him? Why'd he go through that door? I told him not to go through the door. He was the first person who died. When you look at really what's happening with kind of neuroscience right now, what storytelling or theater or even screenwriting would call the suspension of disbelief. How do you tell a story that even if it's fictional, people have an emotional connection to? That it elicits an emotional response, which actually then has a physiological response. It causes your body to react, and you know this is not a real movie, but you're engaging with it as if it was real. And that's just in a fixed timeline of 90 minutes. What happens if you're exposed to a story not over 90 minutes, but over 90 years? How does that affect your emotional status of being and your physiological health? And even more so when it's not just a word that someone tells you that can hurt your feelings. What is the effect of a harmful social discourse on the physiological health of an entire group of people? Specifically when you're not in control of the stories that are being told of you. And those stories are subunits of narratives. Stories threaded together across a common theme to advance an idea, which is often for the benefit of a specific group, is when it becomes what's called a narrative. And when your options as a person in a society are two narratives, one called a narrative of invisibility and a narrative of demonization, and this is how you formulate your identity formation and your sense of value within society, that has real physical health repercussions. And how do we understand mental health in our communities within that context? Suicide rates within that context? How do we understand sexual violence within the ways in which men are told at young ages the stories of what it means to be men? This is the relationship between what is called a structural illness and social forms of healing and the role of storytelling within that. And so there's narrative therapy, which is a subsection of psychology, which is how psychologists have used free thought association in order to open up blacked out memories. often having to do with childhood and sexual trauma, or people, issues of abandonment, people who are no longer in your life, ways to write back to them as an individual. Narrative medicine expands that concept, saying how does this affect entire groups of people, not just as an individual experience, but a collective phenomenon. And with that, and where are they headed now?
I just wanted to ask last week, but I wanted to so I hope many people stick around. There's going to be workshops going on next 3 blocks of time in various groups. And yeah.
Brilliant human rights organizer, Zara Belou, coming through, and Soraya Hosni. Y'all should go connect with them.
Thanks, man. Thank you. Are you taking off or are you around?
What time is it? It's 11. My partner's here, and I think we're going to go ahead over to, what is it? It's AERA, the Education Summit that's going on.
Okay.
A friend of ours is speaking at 12, so we may try to run over there.
Fair enough. All right. If you were going to stick around, I was going to treat you to lunch, but
Hey, maybe.
Now you got-
Hey, no. Well, I'll see you, and then I'll let you know, definitely.
thank you much.
Thank you.
Just want to say thank you. The gift to be able to switch people's mental status upside down, what their conceptions or what they take for granted, and question it. I don't do that too often. So thank you very much.
Oh, please, thank you for being here.
The computer's over here if you have stuff. You know what? Okay. So I'll just turn it off.
It would be good because I cannot, because the house very early. I cannot put the house. Look at